Hey, Don, whenever you're ready, you can kick it off.
Hey, hello, everybody. I want to welcome you all to our webinar about the truth about open net pen salmon farms. Before that, I want to open with a short prayer. I want to thank the Creator for all the wonderful gifts that surround us and that sustain us. I want to thank the Creator for the gifts of thought and reason. Gail Kessler. I want to share with you some information about why we're doing this. And when I talk about we, I'm talking about the BADI group, which is short for the Broughton Aquaculture Transition Initiative. This is 3 nations, the Mamalilakla, the Namgis, and the Quickpasutinakakwapmis, who joined together in the fight to save wild salmon. So we were successful. I'll step back a sec. We had some young people who were tired. They said enough is enough. There was occupations that happened on farms. That brought about a conversation with the provincial government. Then Premier Horgan came up to our big house and met with us, and we entered a process on how we're going to deal with this. And throughout that, we were able to negotiate an agreement that said basically if they cannot demonstrate that these open net pen fish farms are safe for wild salmon in the environment, then they're not going to be able to stay. And also with that, there was also a portion that negotiated to doing science. So we did a whole bunch of science about this. So when I refer to we, I'm referring to the 3 nations, Mamalilakla, Namgis, and Quickpasutinakakwapmis. So one of the main reason we want to host this webinar is often, if not always, when I hear about the issue from the people who support open net fish farms, they use the term misinformation. But I never hear what this misinformation is. It's just a catchphrase. And we have lots of information. And so we've invited a couple prominent scientists and a lawyer who also works with our nations and other nations on the battle to save wild salmon. So the scientists will be speaking about viruses, pathogens, and such, and sea lice, just to share what is the truth. What is the truth about open net pen salmon farms? We want to just have people understand, and this is only a small portion of the information that we have, and there's a short time frame, and we want everybody to open their minds and hearts and have a listen and get this information that simply is the truth, So with that, I'm going to go over to unfortunately, the Mamalilakla are not able to be here today, but Eric Joseph is here, and he's the advisor for the Quickpasutinakakwapmis Hereditary Chiefs. So he's going to share a few words with you now. Gail Kessler.
Thank you, Don. Good morning, everybody. As Don mentioned, my name is Eric Joseph, and I work with the KHFN Hereditary Chiefs. We come from the area of the Broughton Archipelago. We've had a 30-year mandate to remove fish farms, and most recently, the BADI First Nations, the 3 nations that Chief Svanvik had just mentioned, were successful in removing the 17 fish farms that were in our collective territories. I just wanted to mention briefly, I'm not going to be too long, that a lot of the discussion might be on Western science today. As Don mentioned, we have some scientists who've been studying the issues and concerns of fish farms for quite a while. That First Nations traditional knowledge is just as important as Western science. Our traditional laws that need to be recognized. We hope that's part of the reconciliation considerations of Canada and BC, where consent is part of the understanding for us to protect resources in British Columbia and Canada. Our Broughton nations have relied on the resources in our territory for hundreds of years. Obviously, we have clam gardens that, in the Broughton, there's probably 400 to 600 clam gardens. I can't remember the exact number, but it's the most on the coast. So we, at this time of the year, we're out harvesting clams and other species, and these farms have really impacted us, hence the 30-year mandate to remove fish farms. I guess a part of another big process that has been initiated by BC and also Canada is the biodiversity and ecosystem health process and discussions, where BC has committed to amend environmental legislation through the dialogue and discussions with First Nations and British Columbians. So I hope that part of those discussions will also take into account other industries that impact all the resources that British Columbians rely on. So those are some of the things that I just wanted to mention, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion and questions and the good panel that we have here today. Yela Kessa.
Gila Kesla, Eric. And thanks, Dawn, as well for introducing. My name is Amanda Sheedy. I am working with Dawn and Eric and others at Batty to create plans to restore their wild salmon based on their traditional knowledge and their vast experience. I'm based here in Tiohtià:ke in the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, and it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you here today. This was a very, we had about 300 people sign up for the webinar. It is being recorded, just so everyone knows. And we will be posting this on YouTube and sharing it around so that you can share it with others who may not have been able to attend today. My job here today is just to keep things running smoothly. We also have Vance Conway from the Namgis First Nation who's in the background helping out. So thank you, Vance, and a huge thank you and ahead of time to all of our speakers. I will be briefly introducing each of the speakers and letting them know when their time is up. As Dawn already said, this is a huge topic to try and cover in just an hour. So consider this an overview, and we'll be sharing lots of resources in the chat box, so you can keep your eye on that for any other information and resources. I also encourage you to add your questions through the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. If you click on there and you have a question based on what you're hearing, please add your question in there. And when our speakers are done speaking, they will keep an eye on that and answer questions that they can in writing. And we'll keep some for the end for the Q&A session as well. So I think that about covers my end of the housekeeping. So to start off with, I just would like to introduce Sean Godwin. So Sean's research revolves around evidence-based management and conservation in the marine environment. He's been studying the effects of salmon farms on wild salmon populations for the past 15 years. He likes to use field experiments, big data sets, and statistical modeling approaches to tackle questions about aquaculture sustainability and threats to imperiled wildlife. Sean did his PhD at Simon Fraser University in BC, and he's now an assistant professor at the University of California, Davis. So welcome, Sean.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think my screen is sharing. Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks, Dawn, for inviting me here today, and Amanda for organizing. My name is Sean Godwin, as Amanda mentioned, and for the past 15 years, I've been studying the interactions between wild and farmed salmon in BC, with a particular focus on a parasite called the sea louse. And for the past 5 years, I've been a Western Science Advisor on sea lice and salmon farms for the Mamalilika, Namgis, and Kwikasud First Nations as part of BADI. For those who don't know, this is what a salmon farm looks like. This is a pretty normal farm in BC. It might hold 500,000 farmed Atlantic salmon. Some hold upwards of 1 million. And each of these squares is an open net pen, which allows water and pathogens and parasites to flow freely from the farm environment within it to the external environment, the waters of the coast through which wild salmon migrate. And salmon farming is a global industry. So Norway and Ireland and the UK and Atlantic Canada, Chile, they're all major players in the salmon farming world, as is British Columbia. BC, though, is unique among them because it's the only place in the world that produces a large portion of the world's farm salmon and a large portion of the world's wild salmon. As I'm sure that everyone here is aware, wild salmon are the backbone of this coast. They have incredible ecological, economic, and cultural importance to its peoples, particularly the indigenous peoples that have stewarded these fish since time immemorial. And this makes BC a really, really important place to be investigating these interactions between wild and farm fish, because really the stakes here are higher than anywhere else in the world. And a lot of the initial concern about salmon farms stems from BC's decline in wild salmon populations, the decline in catch of wild salmon, coinciding with an increase in farm salmon production. And obviously, these are just two lines on a graph. They're not necessarily related, but this is what has fueled a lot of the concern and the inquiry into this issue. So this is a map of all the salmon farms that were active in the mid-2010s. Since then, some farms have been added, others have been moved, and notably 2 major clusters of farms have been fully or mostly removed due to First Nation decisions in the regions now known as the Broughton Archipelago and the Discovery Islands. And this is what sea lice look like. So each of these brown blobs is a louse. Each of these brown blobs is a louse. And the white lines there are egg strings coming off of the females. And so this is a particularly bad infestation of a wild juvenile salmon. They're usually not this many, but as you can see, they're parasites and they live and feed on the surface tissue and mucus of fish. And you can actually see the dark stains there, the dark scars there are on the fish are from the feeding lice. And sea lice affect wild salmon in many ways. So they affect their behavior, like how much risk they're willing to take to get food. They affect their physiology, like how their immune system functions. They affect their swimming ability, how fast they grow, their body conditions, so like how plump they are essentially, their likelihood of getting eaten by predators, and all this adds up to sea lice decreasing wild salmon survival, whether it's directly or indirectly. And while sea lice were here before salmon farms, they don't normally infest wild juvenile salmon in large numbers. So juvenile salmon is the life stage we're worried about due to the effects of infection at this life stage, because they are smaller and they lack fully developed scales and immune systems to help protect them. So salmon farms change this by providing year-round reservoirs for sea lice that don't naturally exist. And the larval plumes of sea lice from salmon farms extend to an average of 30 kilometers away from the farms, depending on tides and currents. So fish doesn't have to go right next to the farm to get infected. This is a plot showing the tight link between the number of sea lice on Broughton farms in a year on the x-axis, on the bottom there, and the number of sea lice on wild juvenile salmon in the Broughton on the vertical axis there. Basically, the more sea lice on the farms, the more sea lice on wild juvenile salmon in the region. Now, DFO requires salmon farms now to treat their fish to control sea lice on the farms in order to limit the number of lice that are transmitted to wild salmon. Until a few years ago, the only form of treatment used in BC was a pesticide called emamectin benzoate, or SLICE. And this is given to the farm salmon as a coating on their food, which gets exuded through their skin and their mucus layer and kills the sea lice on the farm fish. And this worked decently for a long time. So this is a graph showing the number of sea lice on wild juvenile salmon in the Broughton between 2001 and 2019. And you can see in these early years, there were extraordinarily high numbers of sea lice on the wild juvenile salmon because there were no regulations about controlling sea lice on the salmon farms. And in 2003, the salmon farms were forced to fallow or stay empty, or some of them were. And this drastically reduced the number of sea lice on the wild juvenile salmon in the region. And as a result, DFO started making regulations about managing sea lice. And by 2005, they had mandated that farms must treat their farm fish once they hit 3 sea lice per fish. And this is pretty good results. This decreased the sea lice on farmed and wild salmon for about a decade. But in the last 5 years of this data set, sea lice numbers on wild salmon jumped up again. And this might not look like much compared to those early years, but this is a 3 to 6 times increase from the good years, which can have huge impacts for wild salmon. So what's been going on here? Well, there are two main things happening that are making the sea lice problem worse and will continue to do so moving forward. The first is that climate change is warming our coastal oceans. And since sea lice develop much faster at higher temperatures, this is going to lead to more frequent and more severe outbreaks. And the negative effects of sea lice on salmon growth and on survival are also going to get worse than they already have. The other thing happening is that sea lice on BC farms are now resistant to slice, that treatment chemical, which is making outbreaks on farms much less controllable, and which leads to higher infection rates of sea lice on farmed and wild salmon. This resistance problem has led to salmon farm companies using other treatment methods for sea lice in recent years, but none of them are as effective as slice once was. So these methods include bathing the fish in hydrogen peroxide or in fresh water, or using a hydrolyser boat to essentially pressure wash the lice off the fish. And these aren't as effective as I mentioned, but there's also evidence that the infective lice being pressured wash off the farm fish are often being released back into the ocean alive, ready to infect wild salmon. And all of this is a big deal because the effects of sea lice on wild salmon add up to effects at the population level. So on the bottom, on the horizontal axis here, we have year, and on the y-axis, we have the estimated percent mortality at the population level due to sea lice in wild pink salmon populations in the Broughton. And over the past 5-10 years, while it's been lower than it was in the early 2000s, it's still between 5 and 25% mortality, depending on the year. And as a scientist, it's difficult to see this problem getting much better moving forward in the parts of BC that continue to have salmon farms. There are lots of issues at play. Some of them include sea louse counts by salmon farmers appear to be lower than the true sea louse levels, which means treatments may not be happening when they should be. The BC regulations themselves for when farms must use treatments to control sea lice are less strict than in other salmon farming companies, in other salmon farming countries. And this is surprising because BC is probably the most important to do this well, given the wild salmon populations at risk here. And unfortunately, the DFO science advice being given to the minister on this issue is not in line with the actual peer-reviewed science published by scientists in Canada and around the world. And this is something I believe Sean Jones is going to talk about in his talk later on in this webinar. So combined with climate change and resistance continuing to make the sea lice problem worse, there's not much room for optimism here, unfortunately, with the weight of evidence suggesting that sea lice from salmon farms will continue to negatively affect BC's wild salmon moving forward. That's it for me. Thanks again to Dawn for inviting me to this webinar, to Manna for organizing it, to Tavish Campbell for many of the photos using in this talk, to all my colleagues whose research contributed to this talk, and to the Mamlaka, Namgis, and Kukasudunuka First Nations for all their work with BADI over the past 6 years and whose landmark agreements contributed to a lot of the data and findings presented here. So thank you very much. You're muted, Amanda.
Thanks, Sean. So thanks for that very speedy and succinct overview of the science, Sean. You did a great job. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Gideon Mordecai from the University of British Columbia. Gideon's research considers the ecology of viruses. In other words, their interactions with each other, hosts, and the environment. His most recent research applies to viral genome sequencing to assess the transmission risk posed by wild salmon by Atlantic aquaculture in BC. Welcome, Gideon.
Thank you very much. Just getting set up here. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. My name's Gideon Mordecai. Thank you very much for the introduction, Amanda, and for the invite, Don. Great to be able to present here. I'm a viral ecologist. I've been studying salmon disease since 2016. I was inspired by the title of this webinar, The Truth About Open Net Pen Salmon Farming. So I've put together a presentation which focuses on some truths around disease risks associated with Atlantic salmon farms in BC. This focus on the truth is necessary, since I often hear misinformation around these issues. There's especially a tendency to use the absence of evidence to conclude that there's no risk. So I hope that my presentation today helps to summarize some of the evidence that does exist. In the last few years, there's been big leaps in understanding regarding these disease risks. Much of the work I'm going to present comes out of a collaborative group of scientists, which I'm part of, led by Christy Miller at DFO, and this is in partnership with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. Our collaborative group is known as the Salmon Health Program, and our focus is to understand the cumulative stresses which impact salmon survival, and much of our work looks at risks associated with aquaculture, primarily since this is a risk under direct management control. So some of the research I'm going to present today is my own, but other research is led by colleagues from the Salmon Health Program, and at the end I'm going to provide all the citations which are linked throughout my presentation, and have all references at the end. So when it comes to salmon farming, the crux of the major issue is whether diseases are transmitted from the farms to wild salmon which swim past them. Farms in BC mostly rear Atlantic salmon. They're high density, and disease issues are common on farms. There are a lot of fish crammed into a small area where they're protected from predators. And this is a perfect situation for diseases to proliferate and evolve to become more harmful. And these are actually the same issues that arise in all types of intensive agriculture. So in this presentation, I'm going to explain how salmon farms amplify pathogens and how they're then transmitted to wild fish. And to do this, I'm going to focus on two pathogens, Piscine orthoreovirus, or PRV, and a second pathogen called Tenacibaculum. And I'm also going to explain what happens when wild fish do get infected by these pathogens. But firstly, I think it's important to consider where some of these diseases come from in the first place. So a study I led applied viral genome sequencing, and that's similar to the kind of viral genome sequencing that's used to monitor the transmission of COVID-19 around the world. Our analysis found that the development of Atlantic salmon aquaculture facilitated the spread of disease from Europe to the Pacific coast. Piscine orthoreovirus, or PRV, was first discovered in 2010 and has since been identified as the cause of heart disease in Atlantic salmon. And this disease is a common problem on farms in Europe. Our work looked at the viral genomes found and found that PRV originates from Norway and has been introduced on several occasions to the Pacific coast. The second main issue is that active fish farms serve as fish disease amplifiers. This plot shows the prevalence of PRV on Atlantic salmon farms in BC, and the horizontal axis shows the time since ocean entry. As you can see, by the end of a production cycle, the probability of detection is almost 100%. The high host density on salmon farms mean that pathogens are readily transmitted between fish, and the large numbers of individuals mean there are lots of infected fish amplifying viruses. And these infected fish on salmon farms pose a transmission risk. Studies looking at pathogen detections in the water, a technique known as eDNA or environmental DNA, found that salmon pathogens are more likely to be detected in the waters around active salmon farms than at inactive sites. So a key question is whether viruses like PRV are transmitted from the Atlantic salmon on farms to wild fish. With PRV, our study found that Chinook salmon sampled closer to farms were more likely to be infected. On this plot, the horizontal axis shows the distance from active fish farms. Chinook samples from further away had lower rates of PRV detection. And alongside this, we also looked at the viral genomes in different populations using the viral genome sequencing. And we found that farmed and wild salmon share the same viral variants. Altogether, this evidence indicated that viruses like PRV are continually transmitted from fish farms to wild salmon. But what does this mean in terms of the disease? PRV's role in causing disease in Atlantic and Pacific salmon in BC has been contentious. Upon its discovery in BC, there was heated debate over whether PRV causes a heart disease called HSMI. in Atlantic salmon. We now know that PRV causes this disease. PRV from BC has now been shown to cause heart lesions, and HSMI is diagnosed on farms in BC. However, PRV is linked to a different disease in Pacific species. Same virus, different disease. For example, in Chinook salmon, PRV infects blood cells. These blood cells explode, resulting in liver and kidney damage. And in extreme cases, the clinical signs of jaundice, anemia, and these yellow fish are observed. And this disease has been documented in Chinook salmon farms in BC. And this is the more important point for wild salmon, the disease in Pacific species. And early signs of this disease associated with PRV have been observed in wild juvenile Chinook salmon. I also want to talk about another pathogen common on farms. Tenacibaculum is a globally distributed marine bacteria. It's long known to cause disease in marine fish and a common pathogen in aquaculture. Now, there are a diversity of Tenacibaculum species in BC associated with disease outbreaks on farms. And Tenacibaculum causes mouth rot in Atlantic salmon on farms, and that's what this image at the top shows. And the second image here shows a disease which Tenacibaculum has been shown to cause in Chinook salmon. This plot on the right is from a study that found Tenacibaculum detections peaked in wild juvenile Fraser sockeye as they migrated past salmon farms in the Discovery Islands. So the distance from the mouth of the Fraser River is shown on the x-axis. So you can see as the wild salmon migrated past the Discovery Island farm shown in red, the detections of Tenacibaculum peaked. So this is kind of similar to PRV, where we know that detections spike in fish that are close to farms. But I want to talk a bit more about some of the recent evidence that affirms that Tenacibaculum causes disease in Pacific species. There's a very recent study from New Zealand which identified 2 different species of Tenacibaculum as the cause of a disease which has been impacting farmed Chinook in New Zealand. These are the same bacterial species found commonly on salmon farms in BC. So this study with images on the left found very high levels of mortality, up to 100% in some instances. There's also evidence from here in BC. A study on the right shows images from captive but wild-caught Chinook salmon on the west coast of Vancouver Island, which were observed with the same disease. Similarly, high rates of mortality were also observed, and overwhelming evidence identified Tenacibaculum as the probable cause. As far as we can tell, DFO still assess this pathogen as not posing a risk to wild fish, and their documents cite a lack of evidence to support that conclusion. I'd argue that there's now a weight of evidence which suggests that Tenacibaculum does pose a real risk to Chinook salmon. So a common question is, well, do these pathogens have a population level impact on wild salmon? Christy Miller's group, working with PSF, have been monitoring infectious agents in wild juvenile salmon for over a decade. And they use this data to ask if any of the pathogens they detect are associated with poor stock survival, and also how skinny a fish is, or body condition factor. And out of all the pathogens they tested, and they tested 29 pathogens, the top 2 for negative associations with stock survival and body condition were PRV and Tenacibaculum. In many cases, pathogen impacts were often greater than annual variance in temperature even. And so we know that many of the pathogens they tested are naturally occurring, but the top 2 were these fish farm associated agents that are under direct management control. And so I'm going to wrap up and just run through my conclusions from my presentation today. I showed that the growth of salmon farming has introduced pathogens into new regions and into contact with naive hosts. Atlantic farms have a high density of hosts which favor outbreak dynamics and serve to amplify diseases. Pathogens are in the water near these farms and are then transmitted to wild salmon. And most importantly, these pathogens can cause disease in Pacific salmon, and they appear to have a population level impact. So I've provided a QR code which you can scan with your phone and will bring you to a Google Doc, which will have links to all the citations from my presentation. There's also links, and they might be shared in the chat at some point, to a review which I co-authored with some colleagues from PSF of the disease risks associated with salmon farming, and also a kind of one-pager on the new evidence around the tenacibaculosis disease in Chinook salmon. And yeah, that's me, so thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Gideon. Complicated topic to grapple with in 10 minutes. Again, you did a great job. Thanks so much. So I've shared, and I will continue to share some resources that Gideon just mentioned. So one of them is there already in the chat, and the others are coming. If anyone has any other resources to share, I invite you to do the same in the chat. And just to remind folks, you're welcome to post your questions in the Q&A box. I already see that a number have been answered. So once they're answered, just so you know, there's a few tabs at the top. So once they're answered, they move over into another tab called Answered. So you can go there and have a look at those answers if you're interested. Okay, next up, we have Sean Jones, who practices Indigenous and environmental and regulatory law with a focus on natural resource law. He has extensive experience on fisheries issues, federal and provincial environmental assessments, and advocating for the rights of Indigenous communities. So I'd like to welcome Sean Jones. Thanks so much for being here, Sean. I know you're just off of a plane, so glad you can make it.
Yes, thanks very much, Amanda, for that introduction. And thank you to Sean and Gideon for their overview of the science. I'm speaking to everyone today from the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nation. So when we look at this issue, we've heard from Gideon and Sean on some of the science, and I think they've done a very good job of simplifying it for the less intelligent folks in the crowd like myself, just being a dumb lawyer. But I think it's even more helpful to take a step back here and think about what's going on with this industry. Really, the idea of open net pen salmon farming is based on a 1970s idea that we could just put pens of net cages effectively in the marine environment without any biosecurity, any prevention of transfer of pollutants, pathogens, and parasites to wild populations, and it wouldn't cause any harm. And that's very much based on a 19th century idea that dilution is the answer to pollution, that the ocean is so big that it would dilute any local harm to wild populations. And of course, we know that that's not true. As Gideon and Sean described, we know that industrial scale agriculture amplifies and spreads disease to wild populations. We have ample proof of this, whether it's avian flu, swine flu, or mad cow disease. That's why we don't put poultry farms in avian sanctuaries. It's why we don't have open pens of millions of cattle on the migratory routes of endangered caribou. Yet, for some reason here in British Columbia, the only jurisdiction on the Pacific coast of North America, we allow open net pens of hundreds of thousands or millions of Atlantic salmon on the migratory routes of wild Pacific salmon. Well, why is this? If Sean and Gideon had described to us at a high level this morning some of the truth about the science, why aren't we acting on that truth? And the answer to that really comes down to regulatory capture. Regulatory capture occurs when a regulator has two mandates. A public good mandate here in the case of DFO, our federal regulator, the duty to protect and conserve fish. That's the public interest mandate. And when it has a second mandate, to promote the very industry which it regulates. Regulatory capture occurs when the priority of those two mandates become reversed, where the regulator, in this case DFO, favors the promotion of the industry rather than the protection of the public good, the protection of wild Pacific salmon in this case. And so what's happening here with wild Pacific salmon and this industry is a tactic that we've seen in other industries often called predatory delay. And that's when everybody knows that environmental change is needed, but industry wants to delay the implementation of those necessary environmental changes so that it can continue to profit from that very environmental harm. So those are some fairly bold claims I've made this morning. I'm going to just back up those claims with some information that's very publicly available to document this regulatory capture of the industry, of DFO by the industry. So let's start in 2009 when the BC Supreme Court finds that the regulation of this industry is truly within federal jurisdiction and DFO takes over. 2 years later, or 2.5 years later, the Cohen Commission concludes that there's a conflict of interest between those two mandates and DFO shouldn't have the responsibility to both promote and police the industry. 3 years later, with respect to PRV, the virus that Gideon was talking about, the federal court rules that DFO's conduct was unlawful and unreasonable, that the minister had essentially delegated minister's responsibility to make sure that fish going into these farms are free of disease to industry itself. DFO just handed industry the keys. And the DFO had not adhered to the precautionary principle, saying that DFO's arguments were inconsistent, contradictory, and in any event, fail in the light of the evidence. Again, 3 years later, the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development, an office inside the Auditor General, concluded that DFO did not sufficiently enforce the aquaculture's activities regulation to minimize the harm to wild fish, and also found that DFO was vulnerable to claims that it had prioritized the promotion of the industry over the protection of wild Pacific salmon. In 2018, federal court ruled that with respect to stocking of these farms, DFO exercises no supervisory or objective criteria respecting the testing of PRV. In 2018, the Independent Panel on Aquaculture Science, led by Canada's Chief Science Advisor, found that DFO could not objectively regulate the industry and recommended appointing an independent panel and a departmental science advisor. 2019, the federal court again overturned the found the DFO's regulation of PRV unlawful, found that DFO failed to interpret its core mandate, the protection and conservation of fish, found that DFO did not adhere to the precautionary principle, found that it had breached its duty to consult Namgis First Nation, and failed to even consider the risk to wild Pacific salmon. That's a pretty big finding which beggars belief. DFO didn't even consider the protection of wild fish. In 2020, the Federal Court of Appeal again found that DFO had breached its duty to consult Namgis. Short time later in 2020, Minister Jordan decided to remove fish farms from the Discovery Island. She did so against DFO's bureaucratic advice that found that there was no risk of harm. In 2022, the federal court quashed that decision, primarily because the minister didn't follow DFO's advice. So that's a startling, really finding and development that essentially, when the minister is making a decision, her own bureaucrats aren't supporting her with the science. In 2023, just earlier, less than a year ago, the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, a parliamentary committee, recommended 13 different investigations into DFO's conduct with respect to this industry in British Columbia. I'll summarize a couple of them. Recommendation 33, that Canada's chief science advisor should examine the role of how DFO managers influence DFO scientists and if their influence is ethical. And that for the 9 risk assessments that this industry and DFO relies on to conclude that there isn't any harm from it, that there should be an investigation into the factors that resulted in the suppression of research findings on the impact of sea lice and possibly other issues with a material impact on wild stocks, and to determine if that advice was accurate and or valuable. The DFO has not responded to any of those recommendations. So we have, just in a very brief time, this litany of misfeasance where it's openly documented by people like Parliamentary Committee, federal court justices, the Auditor General's office, and DFO does nothing. We've worked tirelessly to document some of this suppression. Gideon mentioned earlier when PRV was first discovered in 2010, it was then discovered in Canada by Christy Miller Saunders around 2011, 2012. DFO suppressed that paper. It wouldn't allow her to publish that paper. It was only when the Information Commissioner compelled DFO to release that paper 10 years later that we discovered that DFO had this knowledge all along. In 2016, when scientists had confirmed that HSMI, heart and skeletal muscle inflammation disease, was diagnosed in BC, DFO allowed industry to rewrite the press release confirming that disease, so it was only a potential diagnosis. In 2016, DFO suppressed evidence from a Norwegian scientist confirming that PRV did cause HSMI in British Columbia. Similarly, in 2020, DFO just simply allowed industry veterinarians to vote on how to diagnose that same disease in British Columbia. Not surprisingly, they voted for a definition of that disease that defined it out of existence. In 2018, Carl Garver, a scientist with DFO, admitted under cross-examination that when he advised the minister on the risk of PRV under a rapid science response in DFO to the minister on PRV, that he had misrepresented his own paper, saying that that his paper didn't find any evidence of disease or any lesions. In 2020, before Minister Jordan was about to make the decision on the Discover Islands, DFO actively suppressed information on PRV and Tenacibaculum, the 2 disease agents that Gideon spoke about this morning, and it ensured that that information, that emerging information and data, did not reach the minister. Similarly, in 2023, when DFO released its risk assessments on sea lice, it did not include data, and it suppressed information that was contrary to its finding that it didn't suppress, that sea lice didn't cause any impact to DFO, or sorry, to wild salmon. So we have in the short 10 to 12, 13 years that DFO has been regulating this industry, an astonishing list of misconduct where the regulator is just blindly favoring industry. There's very little that we can rely on coming out of DFO now. As Gideon and Sean and I, in another paper that wasn't referenced yet this morning, have recommended, Canada needs to establish an independent body, independent of DFO, to provide an accurate and truthful representation of the science that's emerging on the risk that this industry poses. I would encourage you, I think someone will provide that link in the comments if you have time to read that paper. But more importantly, if you're concerned about wild salmon, you're concerned about the impact that this industry has on our endangered populations of Pacific salmon, make your concerns known by reaching out, writing to the minister, writing to your MP, as Canada and DFO will be making a very important decision on the future of this industry later this year when it contemplates a transition plan for how to address these environmental harms. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for all of you for attending and listening to us speak on this important issue this morning. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Sean. That was a great, again, overview of what I know is a very complex history. Vance, if you wouldn't mind spotlighting all the speakers, and we'll just, collectively tackle some of the great questions that have come in the Q&A. So again, I would welcome anyone who has a question to post it in the Q&A box. That you should see a little icon at the bottom of your screen. So just to follow up on Sean's presentation, and I welcome anyone else because I know Gideon and Sean Godwin and Don, you're all very familiar with this topic. Justin Kane asked if we should be bringing DFO to litigation, and another person asked if there was, sorry, I missed your name, Barbara, if there's any legal remedy to kind of force the DFO to comply. I think right now we're kind of trying to mobilize people to have them feel accountable for what they've promised around this work. But what do you, I'd love to hear from all of you. What are some ways that we collectively or individually can really hold the DFO accountable on this stuff? Yeah, go ahead, Don.
Okay, certainly on Justin's question, I think we absolutely should have the conversation, have a chat about that. I sometimes pretend I'm a lawyer, but I'm not really. So there's needs to be some conversation about what some potential legal remedies are. Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
So I can wade into that question a little bit. And I think that there is, I do think that litigation can provide some remedies. What we saw in 2015 and 2019 are good examples. DFO was taken to court on a decision that it had made by a process called judicial review. The court overturned that decision, right? And so we were able to document that the decision was unlawful and unreasonable. But ultimately, that remedy just turns the decision back to the decision maker, right? And so then DFO just turned around and made the very same decision again in both instances. And that will continue until the misconduct and the misfeasance that I spoke of that's persistent in DFO is corrected. And that correction that many have called for, including Mr. Justice Cohen and including the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, is a political decision. Our cabinet and our politicians need to correct DFO's conduct. And until they do that, this will continue. That's why it is so important to communicate to your politicians, your local MP, the minister, the Prime Minister's office, that this is an issue that is important to you, not just the protection of wild Pacific salmon, but that this misfeasance within DFO needs to be corrected. And I'll just pause there briefly to remind people of Canada's history. The stuff that I spoke of, it's exactly what DFO did 30 years ago when Canada witnessed one of the greatest ecological disasters in history with the collapse of the Atlantic cod fishery. This is the same agency using the same playbook, repeating the exact same misfeasance. We have to tell our politicians that we won't stand for that.
Thank you. Yeah, another interesting question that came in from Sue Oakley is she wants to know how to vote on this. Like, I'm wondering if this is a partisan issue. Like, have any of the parties managed to sort of rein in the behavior of the DFO over the years? And you know, what's the track record of the parties, both federally and provincially, on this?
To my knowledge, all federal parties support the transition of the open net pen industry out of the waters. All of that was in their platform before the last election. The British Columbia government, with current Premier and previous Premier Horgan as well, has been very vocal about this industry. In fact, Premier Eby stated not too long ago that social license for this industry in British Columbia has expired.
Okay, thank you. So an interesting question here from Barbara Flowling and David Graham asking about land-based salmon farming industry. How well is it doing? Is this an alternative? What is the role going forward for land-based fish farms?
Me to take that. Oh,
Let me
sorry,
know
Don,
a
go for
little
it.
bit. The Namgis built a land-based farm. It's small. It's about 300 tons or however. Yeah. And it was just kind of not quite breaking even. We leased it to somebody and they're operating it. And, you know, it's still small. It needs to be a little bigger. But they're doing it. They got it. They're not doing Atlantics right now. They're doing rainbow trout because there wasn't Atlantic smolts available when they had to restock. And they've got it down pat, you know, and I think that the trick is not to get too big. Don't get gigantic, you know, make it 1,000 ton or 1,500 or something and get it going, you know, and you know, if we're and I also think we should be doing it within our country with our own resources so that the money can stay here. So that's my thought on that. It's absolutely doable. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd love to hear from Sean Godwin on this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely doable. It does work. And elsewhere in the world, there are larger land-based salmon farms as well. The open net salmon farming industry in BC has tried to laugh this option out of the room, saying that it's far less profitable, and it is less profitable. And that's because the companies actually have to pay for their inputs, like they have to pay for their land and their water and their filtration, their effluent treatment, instead of letting the ocean do all that for them. Grieg is investing in land-based salmon farms in Japan, which is great. The question of whether salmon is the appropriate aquaculture species is an ongoing one. Salmon farming is actually a really small portion of global aquaculture. Aquaculture is probably needed because we've leveled off our wild fisheries capture since the 90s, despite increasing efforts. So we do probably need aquaculture to step in and fill that gap between the growing human population and the need for seafood protein for those people. But salmon farming is just a really small part of that, and it's probably not the most appropriate method because it takes between 1 and 8 pounds of wild fish to get out a pound of farm salmon. So trying to say that salmon farming is reducing stress on our oceans is pretty disingenuous in that respect. So there's a lot of things to figure out there, but there's lots of forms of lower trophic level aquaculture, like herbivorous fish and things like that, that are probably better options.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Last couple questions here. One from Crystal Weber, and I think this is really apropos way to finish this conversation. She says this might be a largely general question, but if our territories are unceded, why then can the government create and enforce regulations regarding the fish farms on our land? Is this another form of colonialism? So Don or Sean, I think either of you are probably well placed to answer that.
Can I go over the questioning? I was looking at some other questions. Who's this one from?
This is from Crystal Weber.
Crystal Weber. Let me find it. Saw it.
Did you want to take a stab at that, Don, or?
Yeah, that's the $64 million question.
Mhm.
And that's probably a thing where the best answer for that is for our nations to join together. And I mean, we're all in that battle right now, and I don't know, I guess I don't have an answer, but I think we need to work together more cohesively on a lot of these issues so that we can make some ground. The government's moving very slowly when it comes to jurisdiction of us regaining jurisdiction of our territory. So, but so sorry about that, Crystal. I mean, I don't think I can answer the whole thing because that's a tough one. Yeah, that's all. But there is a question from Michelle, and she talks about where these fish are going to spawn, and in all our rivers. I mean, the Fraser River sockeye all have to. Well, they don't all have to. They swim through the inside and the outside of Vancouver Island, but a large portion come through the inside of Vancouver Island. So all the fish in all our territories that certainly are on Vancouver Island have to swim by some fish farms. In our river, the Namgis River, which is a mispronunciation of Namgis, our fish that come out of there have to swim by a bunch of farms up by Port Hardy and that, and they get infected with lice and stuff. So almost all our farms are infected. There's another question from Brian Sue, who talks about in 1960s when there was low salmon returns, and why these salmon if we got rid of the salmon farms, will all the salmon come back instantly? No, they're not going to come back instantly. There's going to be better returns. Removing the open net pen fish farms is one of the things that we need to do. We still have to battle climate change. We still have to battle the historic deforestation and the destabilization of our waterways and rivers and that. Pollution. There's a whole bunch of things that need to be taken care of. The open net pen fish farms is one of the things that we can do now, and it's absolutely will help. So,
Great,
okay.
thanks, Don. We are coming up on the end of our webinar, so I'd just like to send my deep thanks to all of you for taking the time to share your deep wisdom and knowledge with us. I'll hand it over to you, Don, in just a moment to wrap up. But I think there's a big call to action. So thank you all for being here. A huge thank you to our speakers. And I hand the baton over to Don to say the last word and close up for today.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. And I really want to thank our panelists, Gideon, Sean, and Eric, and Amanda, you for making this happen, because my technological ability wouldn't have been able to do that, and Vance for helping us out. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in to learn about the truth of open net pen salmon farms. And remind you, this is just a small glimpse into it. There's so much more information. I want to reiterate what Sean Jones talked about, is writing a letter to our Prime Minister, to the Fisheries Minister, to our MPs. Let's get this sorted out. There are letters that you can I guess cut and paste the word or whatever and send off. I'm going to encourage people to have a look and personalize your letter. I think that holds more weight than sending a letter. But by all means, don't let that stop you from just forwarding a letter with your name on it. One of the things I want to mention is there are First Nations in the province that are supportive of the open net pen fish farms, and that's their right, and I absolutely support their jurisdiction within their territory. But one of the things they don't have, their jurisdiction, that they do have jurisdiction title rights. I'm supportive of that. But what these nations don't have is they don't have the right to impact our rights to salmon, our rights to live traditionally as we have, and they have, you know, we're friends and relatives with many of these nations, you know. So I know that's a question. I mean, there's no way they can control the pathogens and viruses and that come out of the farms. They can't stop wild salmon from passing through their territory and becoming infected, you know, and those are salmon that are shared by, you know, the majority of nations in this province. So I just want to put that out there, you know, because I hear that often too. Okay, these nations have the right to choose what they want in their territory, and they absolutely support that, but they don't have a right to impact mine. So write those letters, and yeah, let's keep this work up to save wild salmon. Like I mentioned earlier, there's more work than this to do, but this is the one we can get done, put this behind us, and start working on the other stuff. So thank everybody for coming. Have a great day. Yalla Kessler. Are we finished?